This is the Apocrypha of Azazel podcast, and I am Azazel, your neighborly god of death. I'm continuing to read through my journals, and as you know, I'm on Book 2. Book 2 is called The War of the Ghast, and today I'm going to read to you Chapter 15, which is titled The Fires of the Forge. Many of you have asked me to give you more information about the magical blade that I gave to Hector Derkules called the Ghast Battle Axe, and so in this chapter I will tell you the brief history of how that glorious weapon was forged. Are you ready? The location is the Drokka kingdom of Kel-Dekaba, the military capital of their world, and the timeline is the years 287 to 298 after Oz. With that in mind, let's continue with our brief history. You may recall in the last chapter how, at his visit to the Well of Wisdom, I showed Hector Derkules a vision of the magical Ghast, and he guessed that the weaponsmith who crafted it was the great Hef Fastuz. You may be wondering, how did he know this? The answer to that deals with the fact that Hef Fastuz was the preeminent weaponsmith of his day, and the products of Hef's smithy were highly prized by all the Drokka and other men throughout Terre Verde. Even during times of peace, men like the Drokkas still valued well-crafted weapons, and such was the case for the Drokka people under King Baldur's day. And as is so often the case, when a true master pursues his craft out of the sheer love of it, the art he produces often finds a way of emerging into the world. And that's exactly what happened with Hef Fastuz's creations. For you see, Hef Fastuz was the undisputed master of all masters when it came to the trade of arms making, during his time or any other. Be it bronze, iron, steel, silver, or any other metal, Hef could smelt, forge, and shape it. Be it diamond, jade, blood ruby, or rokium, Hef could find a way to utilize the gem's best qualities to not only adorn the treasure, but also to use it to increase the actual effectiveness of the weapon itself. Be it flint, slate, obsidian, or adamas, Hef could efficiently incorporate stone into his work as well. And although he was not a carpenter, Hef had the knowledge of what types of wood would work best for the different uses within his own craft too. And lest it not be forgotten, he was a master of the decorative arts, etching, enameling, inlaying, casting, damasking, and gilding. All these and more were within his power to deploy. As a result, it was often said by the Drokka that if a weapon carried the maker's mark of Fastuz upon it, that alone brought magic to its blade. Now in the past, Hef had skillfully produced a multitude of master-crafted items, from a golden longsword whose curved hilt of jade had been fashioned into the shape of a great bear and whose blade had been damascened in silver all down its length with Drokka runes of Nort that read, "With Roki's might on one side and fear not the Ragnarokin on the other," to other blades like mighty warhammers and morning stars of unsurpassed quality and strength, to full suits of chainmail whose interlocking rings of crystal or rokium had been intricately woven together so tightly that no mortal weapon could ever penetrate their protection. Yes, these and many more masterpieces of design had the lonely Drokka weaponsmith wrought. Always did he give them away, and never was the receiver disappointed by the priceless gifts they received. In fact, I'll admit that I even had a Fastuz blade or two. Oh, I never actually used them myself, but I kept them on display in the Gallery of Unholy Death. After all, Hef Fastuz's blades really were works of art, and they fit in well with the whole death motif of my throne room. In any case, it's now time for you to learn about the two magical blades that Hef Fastuz made for Hector Derkules, since these weapons are about to play a pivotal role in our story. And yes, I did say two blades. One that I commissioned from Hef Fastuz, and another blade I didn't know anything about. And little did I know that Hef was going to double-cross me. It was a mistake I almost paid for with my life. About a decade before Hector Derkules became the Conehair Drokka, I paid Hef Fastuz a visit, entering his workshop in secret. I did not reveal myself to him at first, for my plan was to observe him for as long as it took to assure myself that this man really was capable of doing what I needed him to do. And immediately I received a surprise, for the supposedly legendary Hef Fastuz was in fact a cripple. Have I made a mistake? I wondered to myself. How could a man with such handicaps be a master arms maker? I studied the man before me. The man was deformed, with one arm that apparently had never grown since birth, and he was crippled. His legs looked like they were mangled in some accident that occurred long ago. In addition, unlike his vain Drokka brethren, this man clearly didn't care how he looked. His face was pockmarked, his ratty black hair and beard were grimy, and his only clothing, a leather loincloth, reeked worse from sweat than he did. I could also see that his skin and body hair were permanently stained from layers of smoke that constantly spewed from his nearby smithy, and for a moment I was on the verge of leaving. But then my intelligence kicked in, for my wisdom is such that I can see past a book's cover. And I thought to myself, give him a moment to reveal his true nature. Don't judge too soon. Look deeper, Azazel. And so, maintaining my invisibility, I moved closer, peering past Hef's beat-up beak of a nose and into his eyes. And what I saw astounded me. To begin with, I saw the man's pain, and it was clear that Hef had been rejected by his clan from very early age in life. Although this wasn't surprising given his ugliness. But what was surprising was that, in spite of his multiple crushed fingers and his maimed hand, somehow the man had found a way to not only use his body, but to create works of art with it. Although such is often the case with true masters, they find a way to succeed in spite of the odds. After all, I should know, for I am a master as well. But you knew that. Yet, as I looked at his legs, I could see they told a different story. It was apparent that they were mangled beyond use, and I could instantly see that even walking a short distance must have been painful for the man. Luckily for him, he had a companion, in the form of a wolf dog, and I could sense that this was probably Hef's only friend. I could also tell that this was just fine by the man, for he probably didn't want many false friends. It was therefore evident that because of his canine friend, although Hef Fastuz was a hermit of a Drokka, he was not a lonely one. But most of all, as I looked into the man's eyes, I could see that there was mastery there, for Hef oozed that something special, and this gave me the confidence to proceed. I moved back a few steps and prepared to reveal myself, although with a bit of a twist, for as I got into position, Hef continued working and was completely unaware of my presence. I saw him take a hunk of hissing metal out of a pot of water, and Hef laid it on a workbench before him. Pausing to push back his scraggly hair and wiping the dripping perspiration from his brow, the man then turned to his friend, and with much effort he managed to instruct his dog. Garf, there now. Go and grab that chisel for me. Oh, great. The man's a stuttering tool, I thought to myself. This is going to be so much fun. And for a moment I almost stopped this charade, but I continued watching and I saw Hef point to the tool he wanted his dog to fetch for him. And for his part, the wolf dog Garf, with one ear apparently always perched to hear his master's commands, happily made ready to obey the request of his handicapped friend. Yet as soon as the wolf dog stood up on all fours and moved towards the location of the toolbox, a most unexpected event occurred in the smithy. For then it was that I unleashed my surprise, gracing Hef Fastuz and the dog Garf with the presence of the gods. Yes, I did say gods, plural, for I didn't appear to Hef Fastuz in my own form, but instead in the guise of two of the other gods of Mittengarden. And not just any divinities, mind you, but the two most powerful names in Drokka lore, the god Roki and Mindos. Rocky you already know about, for he was the lord of the mountains, the bringer of fire, and the very father of the Drokka race, at least according to their religion. But Mindos is probably new to you, so let me fill you in a bit. You see, unlike Rocky, Mindos wasn't a giant. Instead, he appeared as a Drokka of normal size, but one who was incredibly, read immeasurably old. The Chronicles of Chaldea named Mindos as the Drokka's god of intelligence and healing, and the religious dogma claimed that he came into existence when Baal chopped off the head of He Who Has No Name during their great battle in the time before. Drokka legend states that after Baal left He Who Has No Name for dead, Mindos poured out of the latter's skull and healed him. The tale goes on to say that Mindos later created the Valkyries, and thus the Drokka considered Mindos to be the first Valkyrie of Astengarden and the High Valkyrie, aka the High Priest of the entire Drokka's faith. The Drokka Chronicles also attest that Mindos helped He Who Has No Name to create Ragnaroken, where they later imprisoned Baal. Mindos was thus held to be the brother of He Who Has No Name and the source of all wisdom for the Drokka people. It's a nice story, but naturally this was all poppycock, for the legend was completely made up by Drokka priests over the centuries. In addition, what's also poppycock is that Rocky and Mindos weren't actually the real visitors to Hef Fastuz, for instead that was me, and my magic worked like a charm. Well, at least in the beginning. For his part, dumbstruck by such a surprise, Hef Fastuz was speechless, while Garf quickly ran behind his master's chair to hide, with every hair on his body standing bolt upright in shock. Now, in the 67 years of his life so far, Hef Fastuz had never before met with either of these two deities. Yet upon their arrival in his forge, the man instantly knew who they were, and his reddish-brown eyes flamed even brighter than the nearby fires in his forge. For there could be no mistaking of these two figures that were so ingrained in the religion of the Drokka people. And that's what I was banking on. Therefore, Hef at once dropped his hammer and tried to brush away the grimy ash that covered his body. "Oh look, the gimp is trying to make himself presentable," I laughed to myself. And then, despite the gross deformity of his legs and feet, and thus the great pains it obviously caused him to do so, I watched as Hef Fastuz fell to his knees before my apparitions and bowed his head in respect. Okay, to be honest, that effort nearly touched my heart, and yes, I do have one. But don't get carried away here. I mean, Hef's painful genuflection only nearly touched me. Almost, but not quite. Seeing the labor of the man, my made-up Mindos helped Hef Fastuz to rise again. You see, I do have a heart after all. And then, the crippled smith recovered from the shock of having two immortals suddenly appear in his forge. And when that happened, I had my Rocky lay down a 2-ton black boulder that he was carrying and put it at Hef Fastuz's feet. "Dost thou know what to do with this?" my Mindos asked of the man. Yes, master," Hef struggled to reply. "Excellent. And you shall name it the Ghast," my version of the first Valkyrie averred, and then from within the flowing white robes that my Mindos had on, I pulled out a special object and handed it to the man. "And here is your chisel." Accepting the glowing gift with his smoke-stained, mangled hands, Hef Fastuz bowed and stammered, "Thank you, at your bidding, sire." And then, holding the magical new tool in one hand, Hef picked up his trusty hammer in the other, and at once began to work upon the ebon stone that Rocky had laid before him, eventually chipping it down to its very core, whilst what he thought were his beloved gods watched over him approvingly. Yes, that's the legend that would later appear in the Drokka Chronicles concerning the forging of the Ghast and the Grim. Of course, the Chronicles didn't mention my involvement at all, for nobody knew about it. But what I didn't know about was that Hef Fastuz would make not one, but two magical weapons, the latter completely unbeknownst to me. How could I have made such an error? Well, unfortunately, Hef Fastuz's mind was always closed to me. Recall that I told you in the past that I could search out the minds who had a penchant for the dark side, but unfortunately these certain innocents of the world like Hef had always given me difficulty. In retrospect, perhaps I should have chosen a different smith to make the Ghast, but traveling down the path of regret has never served much purpose to me, so why wonder about what-ifs now? The fact is that I, in the form of the fake Mindos and Rocky, was the one who gave Hef Fastuz instructions to forge the Ghast battle axe. And I also gave him that magical gem rock to make the blade from. I knew the creation would take time, perhaps multiple decades, and I did occasionally check on him while he was working, but since the process for interacting with Hef actually required me to visit him in person, and that was so tedious, and since I had so many other things on my plate at the time, for the most part I just left Hef alone. And that was my mistake. Because what I didn't know back then was that the real Rocky and Mindos apparently also visited Hef Fastuz. I guess Mindos was able to pry Rocky away from his love Gaia for this much at least. And the point is that those two meddling gods actually had the gall to give Hef Fastuz secret instructions to create a second blade from the magic rock that I had provided. A dagger they called the Grim. Now I gotta pause here for a moment and ask, can you believe the nerve of these two? I mean, in my wildest dreams, I would not have imagined interfering with another god's experiments. You just don't do that in our world. I mean, it's like an unwritten rule among us gods. Don't mess with someone else's work. The sheer lack of respect involved here is unfathomable, and I realize it may not sound like much to you. After all, you humans backstab each other all the time. But for a god to do this to another god, I mean, it's like violating Divinity Rules 101. It just doesn't happen. Only it did, and to me! In any case, this is how both the Ghast and the Grim were created, from the primary ingredient that I had provided, a dark stone that was magical in its own right, for its carbon-based rock was practically a living part of the earth, and I had harvested it when it was on the very verge of turning into unbreakable diamond, and I took it from the bowels of Mittengarden. I knew that in the hands of a master craftsman like Hef Fastuz, he could use this magic gem rock to create a blade for the Ghast that would turn that battle axe, and the man who wielded it, into a killing machine. And that was my intention for Hector Derkles, that he would use this blade to attempt to destroy the Drokka, with the resulting war providing me with nigh limitless fodder to conduct my death communals, and therefore search for intelligence about de Gaulle. Remember, that was the blade that was destined to supposedly kill me. But what I didn't intend was that the real gods, Rocky and Mindos, would not only instruct Hef to create a second blade, but more importantly, that they would provide the smith with magic of their own to put into both weapons. Yet that is exactly what happened. And so it was that the Drokka, Hef Fastuz, turned the mysterious stone that I gave him into the two most powerful weapons ever created in the entire history of your world. Only much later did I learn that, because of the meddling of Rocky and Mindos, both of the blades Hef forged were capable of destroying any of the hate-filled gods of Ragnaroken. That meant dreaded Tsar, the god of war, Hecubus, the vile seductress of temptation, Naxos, the lord of the raging seas, and Nectar, yours truly, were all viable targets, because the deadly strike of either the Ghast or the Grim could spell our doom. I mean, do you really think I would have let Hef create such weapons had I known all this? Okay, well, maybe taking out Tsar, Hecubus, and Naxos wasn't all that bad, but I certainly wouldn't have given Hef the power to create a blade that could kill me too. I mean, damn my rivals for interfering. It really steams me. You might be wondering, how could the Grim or the Ghast destroy my mates and I? What about our so-called immortality? Alas, forget not my flaw, friend. And yes, I know it's hard to believe, but I do have flaws. Remember, back then I was still subject to the control of Baalzebub, aka Lucifer, and his father Zebub in Illusia. And remember, the Drokka called Illusia Ragnaroken. As a result of my allegiance to Baalzebub, the life force that sustained me on the middle plane at the time was called Hellfire. And it was this hellfire that allowed me and the other fallen luminarchs from BZ's camp to survive upon Mittengarden for nigh 1,000 years. But as our hellfire dwindled, we had to return to the underworld to beg old BZ for more. Now the important thing to know is that if our hellfire ever ran out, then so did our immortality. And what made the Grim and the Ghast a problem for my friends and I was that these blades were capable of instantly draining out our hellfire. And with our life force thus depleted, either of these mighty blades could literally hold the aura of any of the gods of Ragnaroken around itself and strike us dead, before we had the opportunity to return to Illusia for help. For as the Drokka chronicles attest, Roki provided the might, Mindos the magic, and Hef Fastuz the weapons crafting skills, and thus were born the blades with which to kill a god. And that doomed god was almost me. Perhaps only this particular trio could have combined to produce such a work as these arms, perhaps not. In any event, nothing of their kind had ever been forged before or since, and although their intended destinies would not be realized for centuries, hence their production, soon they altered the very course of your world's early history. The Grim's blade was made from the extreme utmost core of the carbon diamond gemrock I gave Hef Fastuz. It was all and entirely black, seemingly an object that sucked the very surrounding light into itself. Or at least it appeared that way. For in reality, if one looked closely at its surface while in complete darkness, then that person would behold, glowing in diamonique flame, the vertical letters G-R-I-M, emblazoned lengthwise upon each side of its flat shanks. Now this amazing sight could only be appreciated in the black absence of light, wherein the dagger itself would then appear as a beacon of hope, a light in the darkness. And because it included a powerful magic called the Voice of the Valkyrie, the Grim could give one the ability to call forth the hand of he who has no name, even during the most dire of one's darkest days. And yet, because these last claims were not able to be readily demonstrated, as a result, for what practical purpose the knife was best suited for, the Drokka chronicles never said. Nor did Hef Fastuz. Thus, despite its strange magic, the Grim appeared to be little more than a simple black dagger, whose outdated stone blade was attached to a common silver hilt, and whose only adornment of note was a single ruby in its pommel, one that had been carved and inlaid in the shape of a single letter, G. In fact, because it was so commonplace, I never paid this blade a second glance during the few times I actually visited Hef to check on his progress with the blade that I had commissioned him for, because my sole focus was on the Ghast. And really, to be honest with you, I don't even recall seeing the Grim there when I did visit. Now, for all the lack of accoutrements of the Grim, the Ghast I had encouraged Hef to make was entirely the opposite. For the Ghast was truly the most formidable weapon ever forged. Certainly it was the most awe-inspiring, for one look at it could strike fear into the heart of any foe, thereby immediately giving the Ghast's wielder an advantage in a fight. Now the Ghast was an iron-hafted broadaxe with a blade of black carbon diamonds, whose edge had been specially tempered never to dull, for thus was the craftsmanship of Hef Fastuz. 2. Whereas the Grim's blade was black as night, the Ghast cutting edge glowed so brightly, despite the blackness of the stone it was forged from, that to gaze upon the Ghast's surface might cause one to be momentarily blinded. Yet another advantage for its wielder in war. As I mentioned to you before, the length of the Ghast's iron haft was decorated with golden plate, upon which were embossed Drokka runes of power in tribute to their mythical heroes Ajax and Volsung, and these runes made the plate that covered the haft into a work of art, for so skillfully were they crafted that the runes appeared to dance depending upon what angle someone looked at the weapon. Opposite the large-headed cutting edge, Hef had flared the reverse blade into two cruelly curved 4-inch barbs, designed for ripping and tearing into one's victims. In addition to its fearsome appearance, the Ghast also had the infused power of two immortal gifts I had provided, namely, limitless endurance and unmatched power during battle. And as if that wasn't enough, what I didn't know was that the real gods Mindos and Rocky had instructed Hef to infuse two additional secret powers, specifically the might of Rocky and the mind of Mindos. What was the end result? Whatever the Ghast wielder hit, he destroyed. Now understand something. The forging of these two blades was no overnight job. The Grim and the Ghast actually took Hef Fastuz nearly 10 exhausting years to complete, working the entire time in seclusion, although that 10-year pace was much faster than I actually thought it would be. I guess part of the reason for the speed in creating these blades was that more than anything, Hef Fastuz actually loved the labor of his craft. He toiled ceaselessly at his smithy, and thus he was able to transcend his normal existence and reach a plane of reality that only few could comprehend. For thereby did the blacksmith find the ability to feel an inner peace that only true mind and body masters can ever fathom. I sense you'd like to know more about Hef's inner peace and how he achieved it. Well, sadly, like most humans, you lack the patience to be a body-mind master yourself, so do yourself a favor and just forget about that line of thinking. It will only cause you frustration. In any case, all journeys eventually end, and Hef Fastuz finished his two most famous masterpieces by the time he was 77 years old. Shortly after he completed the production of the Grim and the Ghast, Hef knew that he would have to again make his usual journey to the Drokka kingdom of Iztak, for always upon completion of a token of power did the highly devout smith dutifully consult the runes, relying on the wise ones to interpret them for him. And so, around the middle of the year AO 298, Hef Fastuz made arrangements for his trip, an underground journey via the Drokka byways in a cart pulled by his beloved dog Garf. As you know by now, Iztak was the home of the Well of Wisdom, and Merkur the Wise. It was Merkur who read the runes and instructed Hef to give his gifts to Hector Derkeles. Naturally, Merkur was acting under my instructions, as provided to him in advance by the Spirit of the Well of Wisdom. Unfortunately for me, Merkur was so focused upon the Ghast, knowing what it would mean if such a weapon got into Hector's hands who wanted war, that Merkur, as a fool, paid no attention to the Grim. This meant that I had missed a precious opportunity to learn of that diabolical little blade when I questioned Merkur about his visit with Hef, for Merkur knew nothing about anything beyond the Ghast. As for Hef Fastuz, he didn't think twice about the implications of giving his magical gifts to Hector Derkeles, for not only was it common knowledge that Hector would eventually become Conehair Drokka, but more importantly, the ultra-religious Hef believed in the adage, "If the runes foretell some, then reality must become." Thus, the smith didn't question Merkur's reading of the runes, and instead Hef and Garf headed home and waited for Hector to arrive. At this time, it was late in the year AO 298. The Sikh twin towers were still standing, and Baldur was still the king. But the meeting between Hector and Hef was one that promised to change the world. And I'll tell you about that meeting in the next chapter. Until then, I encourage you to go to my website, apocryphaofazazel.com. Sign up for my book club so you can be notified when new podcast episodes are released. And if you can't wait to listen to the episodes, why not read my books right there on my website right now? All the books are there, apocryphaofazazel.com. And as always, I want to give a shout out to YouTube's free audio library for the music of this podcast, freesound.org for the sound effects, and transistor.fm for hosting this podcast. Until next time, I'll throw it out there once again. If you want the god of death to visit you, you need only call my name, Azazel, 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 and I'll be there.